The Silent Curse. It was late October 2022 when Ellie, Mark, Ben, Sarah, and Jake set off for a weekend camping trip to Blackwood Forest in Pennsylvania. They had heard rumors about the forgotten town of Blackwood, a place abandoned over a century ago after a mining disaster killed half the population and drove the survivors away. Now the town was little more than crumbling ruins hidden deep within the woods, the perfect setting for an adventure, or so they thought. As the sun began to set behind the towering trees, they finally arrived at the site, a small clearing near the ruins of an old church. The structure was barely standing, its roof collapsed, and its wooden doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. The group set up their tents, joking about the eerie atmosphere as they prepared for the night ahead. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed peaceful enough at first. Too peaceful. Ellie, always observant, was the first to notice how unnaturally quiet the woods were. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves from animals, not even the sound of insects. The silence seemed to press in on them, heavy and strange, but none of them wanted to voice their unease. After all, it was just a camping trip. They were there for fun, and no one wanted to spoil the mood. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, sharing stories about the ghost town's supposed curse. Locals believed that Blackwood was haunted, that those who ventured too far into the forest either disappeared or returned changed, if they returned at all. Jake, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "Just old stories to keep kids away from the woods," he said, tossing another log onto the fire. But as the night grew darker, they began to hear it. Faint at first, a low rhythmic sound coming from deep within the forest. It was like chanting, a distant hum that seemed to rise and fall in the wind. Ellie glanced at Ben, who had been sitting quietly, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, the firelight reflecting his growing unease. The others dismissed it as just the wind, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was watching them from the trees. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. That night, Ellie lay awake in her tent, her eyes wide open. The soft murmuring of the wind through the trees should have been comforting, but she couldn't forget the rhythmic chanting she'd heard earlier. Was it just her imagination? She closed her eyes, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the forest. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the stillness. Ellie sat up, her heart racing. She unzipped her tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. Across from her, Ben sat by the fire, his back hunched, staring into the dying flames. His posture was tense, and he seemed unusually still. She crawled out of her tent and walked over to him. "Ben, you okay?" He didn't answer at first, his eyes locked on the dark forest beyond the campfire. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard it again." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. "The chanting?" He nodded slowly. "It's getting closer." They sat in uneasy silence for a few moments, the forest around them unnervingly quiet. Then, Jake stirred in his tent, poking his head out. "What are you two whispering about?" Before either of them could respond, Mark suddenly appeared from his tent, pointing toward the woods. "Do you guys see that?" he asked, his voice hushed but urgent. Ellie followed his gaze and spotted it, far in the distance, deep between the trees, a faint, flickering light. It pulsed slowly, like an old lantern being carried through the woods. "That's odd," Sarah muttered, as she emerged from her tent, rubbing her eyes. "Is there someone else out here?" "It's probably just some campers messing with us," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Let's check it out tomorrow." Mark agreed, but Ellie wasn't so sure. The light was too erratic, almost unnatural, and the chanting still echoed faintly in her mind. As they tried to go back to sleep, the forest grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply. Then, without warning, the fire went out completely, leaving them in total darkness. The trees around them stood tall and silent, but as Ellie scanned their outlines, she noticed something else. Strange symbols, freshly carved into the bark, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, the group set out to explore the town, the strange events of the night lingering in their minds. No one spoke much as they walked, their usual banter replaced by an uneasy silence. The flickering light they had seen was gone, but the eerie carvings on the trees remained. No one could explain how they got there, or why they seemed freshly etched into the bark. As they ventured deeper into the ruins of Blackwood, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The town itself was barely recognizable. A few collapsed buildings, rotted wooden frames, and the remnants of what might have once been a schoolhouse. The most intact structure was the church, its crumbling steeple still visible through the thick canopy of trees. Inside the remains of an old house, Mark stumbled upon something unusual, a child's doll, sitting perfectly upright in a corner. Its clothes were tattered, but it was oddly clean, as though untouched by time. "This is weird," he muttered, picking it up. The others gathered around, sharing uneasy glances. There was no reason for the doll to be here, in the middle of an abandoned town that had been left to decay for over a century. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every so often she caught movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. Just shadows playing tricks on her, she told herself, though the creeping sensation of unseen eyes watching them never left. As the group pressed on, Mark discovered something even more disturbing, a dusty old journal lying under a pile of rubble in what had once been a living room. Its pages were yellowed, but still legible. The journal belonged to a miner who had lived in Blackwood before the disaster. In it, he described strange occurrences in the town, whispered chants in the night, strange symbols carved into trees, and dark rituals held by a group of townsfolk seeking protection from the spirits of the woods. One passage stood out: "Do not linger when the forest grows quiet." The warning hit Ellie like a punch in the gut. The forest had been unnervingly silent ever since they arrived, a silence that now seemed far more sinister. Mark, who had been skeptical, shrugged it off as the ramblings of a superstitious man, but Ellie knew better. Something was terribly wrong with this place, and it was watching them. By late afternoon, the group returned to their camp, the weight of the day's discoveries settling over them like a dark cloud. Ellie couldn't shake the unease that had gripped her since reading the miner's journal. The phrase, "Do not linger when the forest grows quiet," played over and over in her mind. The silence was omnipresent, suffocating, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. Jake, the most skeptical of the group, was growing increasingly frustrated. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, pacing by the campfire. "There's no curse, no ghosts. It's just an old town falling apart. I say we pack up and leave tomorrow." But Ellie shook her head. "We should leave now. The journal. What if it's right? Something isn't right here." Jake rolled his eyes. "Come on, Ellie. You're letting old stories freak you out. There's nothing in these woods but trees and our overactive imaginations." Before anyone could respond, Jake stormed off into the trees, muttering under his breath about how they were letting themselves get scared over nothing. "I'm just going to clear my head. Be back in a few," he called over his shoulder. The minutes ticked by, then an hour, and Jake didn't return. At first, the group thought he was just blowing off steam, but when the sun began to dip lower in the sky, worry set in. Ellie, Mark, Ben, and Sarah grabbed their flashlights and began calling his name, their voices echoing in the empty forest. But there was no answer, only the oppressive quiet of the woods. Ellie's heart raced as they followed Jake's trail, his footprints clearly visible in the soft earth. The path led deeper into the forest, away from their camp and the ruins of Blackwood. But then, abruptly, the footprints stopped. "What the hell?" Ben whispered, his voice shaking. Where did he go? There were no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves, just an eerie stop, as if Jake had vanished into thin air. Mark shouted into the trees, his voice filled with a mix of fear and frustration, but the forest swallowed his words, giving nothing back. The air grew colder as night fell, and Ellie could feel the tension rising among them. Then in the distance they saw it again, the same flickering light from the night before, moving between the trees. But this time it didn't feel distant. It felt like it was coming for them. And Jake was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as the light flickered through the trees. Mark's shouts faded into tense silence, replaced by the weight of the growing realization. Jake was truly gone, and the forest was playing tricks on them. Ellie felt a deep dread take root inside her. They weren't just lost, they were being hunted. Desperate for answers, they returned to the campsite, the once comforting space now feeling like a trap. Mark grabbed the miner's journal, flipping through its brittle pages with shaky hands. "We missed something," he muttered. "There has to be something we can do." The journal described the mining disaster that had supposedly wiped out half of Blackwood's population, but it also detailed the town's descent into darkness long before the collapse. The townspeople had made a pact with what they believed were spirits of the forest. They sought protection from the wilderness that surrounded them, but the deal was never meant to last. When the townspeople broke the pact by cutting down sacred trees and mining too deep into the earth, the spirits turned vengeful. "There were rituals," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper as she read over Mark's shoulder. The townsfolk tried to appease the spirits with offerings, chants, but it wasn't enough. The spirits took what they wanted: people. She paused, her heart pounding. "That's why the forest is so quiet. It's not empty. It's watching us." Ben rubbed his temples, his anxiety turning to anger. "So what now? Are we supposed to believe some ancient curse is the reason Jake's missing?" "It's not just a curse," Ellie replied. "It's a trap. The spirits lure people here, then take them. That's why no one ever returns from Blackwood. We're caught in the same cycle they were." Mark's voice was tight with fear as he read aloud from the journal. "Once the spirits have marked you, there's no escape. The forest warps, and time loses meaning." "Maybe we can break the cycle," Sarah suggested hesitantly. "Maybe we can end it." Ellie shook her head. "We have to leave, now." But as they packed up, the forest seemed to shift around them, the trees growing darker and more oppressive. Ellie glanced over at the symbols on the trees, glowing faintly in the fading light. The curse was real. It had claimed Jake, and if they didn't leave soon, it would claim them too. But the forest wasn't going to let them go so easily. As they hurried through the forest, the tension among the group began to unravel into fear and paranoia. The once clear path to their campsite now felt unfamiliar, as if the forest itself had shifted. No matter how hard they tried, every turn seemed to lead them back to the same spot. The trees loomed closer, their shadows twisting into unnatural shapes. Mark was the first to break. His steps grew erratic, and his eyes darted nervously around the darkening woods. "We're walking in circles," he said, his voice rising in panic. "The trees, they're moving. I swear they are." He stopped suddenly, turning toward the others. "Do you hear that? They're whispering my name." Ellie reached out to calm him, but he jerked away, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I'm not crazy. There's something out there, something following us." His voice trembled as he backed away from the group, scanning the forest with wide eyes. Ben tried to reason with him. "Mark, there's nothing out here but us. You're just scared, man. We all are. But we need to stay together." Mark shook his head violently. "No! You don't get it. I can hear them. They're calling to me." Suddenly, Sarah gasped, her eyes fixed on a figure in the distance. "Jake," she whispered. Ellie spun around, her heart lurching in her chest. Far ahead, just beyond the tree line, a shadowy figure stood, motionless, watching. For a fleeting moment, it looked like Jake, the same height, the same stance, but his face was obscured by shadow. Ellie took a step forward before Ben grabbed her arm. "It's not him," he warned. "It can't be." The figure disappeared into the trees as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. Sarah stood frozen, her breath shallow. "I saw him," she insisted, her voice shaky. "I know I did." But Ellie wasn't sure anymore. Reality was warping around them. The forest was playing tricks on their minds, feeding off their fear. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and the oppressive quiet only made it worse. As they pressed on, Mark's paranoia deepened. He kept stopping, turning back, and muttering about the voices. His fear became contagious. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, certain she saw movement in the shadows. The trees seemed to close in tighter, and the path they followed twisted into a maze of confusion. Ellie's own mind raced. The curse wasn't just physical. It was mental. It was driving them to madness, one by one. And the forest wouldn't stop until it had all of them. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to consume them. Every step felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening, pressing down on Ellie and the others. Mark was barely coherent now, muttering under his breath, his eyes wild and darting. Sarah, pale and shaking, kept her distance from him, while Ben stayed close to Ellie, trying to keep his own fear under control. But Ellie knew the truth. They were losing. The forest was winning. "We need to find that church," Ellie said, her voice steady but tense. She clutched the miner's journal tightly in her hand, its pages a fragile tether to reality. "If the spirits are tied to this place, the church is the key. We need to end whatever ritual they started." The group pushed forward, though the trail was now more treacherous than ever. Twisted roots grabbed at their feet, the trees seemed to shift and sway, as if alive, and the once flickering light was gone, replaced by the oppressive dark. But at last they spotted the crumbling steeple of the church rising above the trees, barely visible through the thickening mist. The church was even more decrepit than they remembered. The roof had caved in, leaving gaping holes in the structure, and the wooden door hung precariously off its hinges. But the moment they stepped inside, they felt it. A cold, malevolent energy thrummed through the air. The walls were lined with the same strange symbols they had seen on the trees, glowing faintly in the darkness. In the back of the church, beneath the collapsed altar, they found it. An old stone slab covered in intricate carvings, the source of the curse. The journal's final entry had mentioned a ritual meant to summon the spirits, an offering that had gone wrong, leading to the town's destruction. And this slab was the heart of it. "This is it," Ellie whispered. "This is where it all started." Mark's eyes widened in fear as he backed away, clutching his head. "We shouldn't be here. They'll take us just like they took Jake." Ben knelt by the slab, running his hand over the cold stone. "We have to destroy it," he said firmly. "It's the only way." But before Ellie could respond, a gust of icy wind ripped through the church, and the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The chanting began again, louder now, surrounding them. Ellie's heart pounded as she realized they had triggered something ancient, something angry. And then, as she reached for Ben's hand, he vanished. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. A scream lodged in Ellie's throat, her mind racing with terror. She was alone. The forest had taken him too. But she couldn't stop now. The slab was their only hope. Ellie stood frozen, staring at the spot where Ben had vanished. The air was thick with the sound of the chanting, guttural, rhythmic, and growing louder. Her chest tightened as fear gripped her, but she forced herself to move. She had to end this, for Ben, for Sarah, for Jake, for all of them. She turned toward the stone slab at the heart of the crumbling church, the symbols on its surface pulsating with a dim, unnatural light. With trembling hands, Ellie pulled a nearby rusted metal rod from the debris. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the chanting intensified, the voices blending into a deafening hum. She knew what she had to do. She had to destroy the altar. It was the center of the curse, the link to the spirits that haunted Blackwood. If she could shatter it, maybe, just maybe, she could break the cycle. As she raised the metal rod, a chilling whisper echoed through the church. "Ellie." She spun around, her heart pounding. There, in the shadows by the door, stood Jake. He looked just like he had the last time she saw him, except now his eyes were hollow, darkened pools of emptiness. "Jake?" Her voice cracked. It couldn't be him. It wasn't him. He stepped forward, his face blank, expressionless. "Come with us," he whispered, his voice layered with other voices, like the forest itself was speaking through him. "It's already too late." Ellie's grip tightened on the rod. "No, you're not Jake." Without hesitating, she swung the rod down with all her strength, smashing it into the stone slab. The crack echoed through the church, and the ground beneath her seemed to shudder. The symbols flickered and dimmed, and for a moment, the chanting stopped. The oppressive air lifted slightly, and Ellie dared to hope. But then, the silence returned. The deep, eerie quiet of the forest, heavier than before. The slab was cracked but not destroyed. The curse wasn't broken. Ellie stumbled back, her heart sinking as the shadows in the church began to shift and swirl, converging toward her. The forest hadn't let go. The spirits, the curse. It wasn't something she could just smash away. It was alive, eternal, and now it had marked her. With a final icy whisper, the shadows closed in, and Ellie felt the world fall away. 2 weeks later, a local search party found the campsite abandoned and untouched. No sign of Ellie or her friends. All that remained was her journal, its final pages filled with frantic scrawls, ending with a single haunting line. "The forest grows quiet again. They are waiting." Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos.